Hi, thank you, Esther, for this nice introduction. My name is Bart de Witte. I'm happy to be here at the HealthX InsurTech event. I'm unfortunately locked down at home, and I hope I can, through this remote presentation, inspire you all to think a bit further. And I wrote a presentation called The Healthcare Dilemma, and it's about balancing scarcity and abundance in the future of healthcare, because this is what is keeping me busy most, is how we can use digitalization to solve the problem of inequality in healthcare. And I will start with a social or professor in social theory who lectures at the LMU in Munich, Professor Amin Azeh. He wrote a really inspiring book called Muster, and he said something very simple in that book. He said that digitalization is nothing else than the duplication of the world through data. And by reading that book from a different view as a social theorist, he looked at digitalization very differently, and he started to activate me in asking questions. So if you duplicate the world, what kind of world are we actually duplicating? But mostly I was trained, okay, digitalization is always about solving a problem. Like, for example, Tesla, who solves the problem or tries to solve the problem of autonomous driving by creating a duplication of our world through data in which he simulates a whole new virtual reality that kind of creates all unexpected situations so his AI can learn how to drive in autonomously. Then in biology, we have been simulating or duplicating the world through simulation since a long time, and depending how much compute power we have, we can start simulating more away from just on a molecular level to going to a cell level, and then moving to simulations on an organic level, and perhaps on a whole human level, creating virtual avatars. And last year, we had a duplication of the world through data in that the database of the whole human proteome was published as an open source database. So that was kind of trying to solve the problem for drug discovery and how we can rapidly or create the folding problem or duplicate the folding problem through a simulation by data. But then there are very different ways of people trying to solve a problem. This kind of situation here from South Korea, where a mother did not have time to say goodbye to her daughter, and her daughter died in an accident, and they recreated or duplicated her daughter through data. So they took all kind of videos, imaging, voice, and then created this simulation.
엄마 어디 있었어? 엄마 내 생각했어?
맨날
나는
해.
엄마 많이 보고 싶었어.
엄마도 너 보고 싶었어. 우리 나연이.
And I will stop here because this is really touching, and then you see how these data duplications are becoming real and very emotional, because I think everybody could feel the empathy of that mother in the duplication of human life in this case. And there are companies and startups that are starting to play with this, that we are duplicating ourselves. For example, this is Replica AI, a company that asks you to donate all your communication data so they can create a duplication of the self. And I looked into the terms and conditions of this startup, and it was quite particular that they don't allow you to own your own self as an AI model, because you don't own the AI models that are trained on your data. And that raises a lot of questions when we start moving forward to the metaverse, where we are simulating the whole world, and we are using biometrical data to simulate our bodies, our reflections, our eyes, or every mimic that we have, and we're donating that data to these applications to create a virtual reality or a metaverse. So we have to ask, and that company that just was mentioned, Meta, is not the company that gives us a lot of rights on data. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what kind of duplication do we really want when we digitize healthcare? Are we really only focusing on solving the problem, or are we creating a much more bigger problem? And that means that we only do not duplicate the world through data, but we also duplicate values and norms. And I think when we look at healthcare, we really need to think about norms and values. And I'm a sci-fi fan, and I watched a Netflix series called Altered Carbon. And this is a series that goes 250 years in the future. And by watching this, something really fell out of, you will watch it yourself. So this is a future where 250 years ahead, they have skyscrapers that go 3,000 meters high. They are flying in cars. They can plug out consciousness and put it into other bodies. And everything is kind of there where there's a nerd you can dream of. All the tech that is there in abundance. But then they enter the hospital. And then this happens.
I need some help here.
Put her finger on the scanner.
Is that gonna stop the fucking
You
bleeding?
need to pay for services. I'm sorry, but Miss Ortega has insufficient resources for specialized treatment. I'm sorry, but Miss Ortega has insufficient resources for specialized treatment.
You're just gonna let her die?
Of course not. We don't turn anyone away. We'll help her as soon as we can. I just assumed that...
Yeah.
Please, right this way.
And this is where it stuck to me, that when I watched the surgery, there was nearly no human involved anymore. And I asked myself the question, how in the hell can we fly cars, plug in consciousness in new bodies? And that seems to be democratized. But we haven't solved access to healthcare. And I think that is really a lot to do with the narratives of the future that we create, but also a lot to do with the values and the norms. And I'm not an anti-US person, but every region has their own values. And if you look, I'm a proud European, if you look at the values and the norms in Europe, and we look at the right to healthcare and the right to privacy, we have much more rights. This is probably why on the AI and Democratic Index, Germany ended up ranking number 2 and the US only number 35. We have very different norms and values when it comes to looking at markets. In Europe, we want to redistribute. They want each part of Europe to flourish. We want polypolies and not monopolies. We have healthcare systems that are based on the principle of solidarity, versus in the US, where it's purely market-driven and private. And you see all the inequalities in that. So looking at that, I said, like, what is the main point that actually drives to that digital scenario in 250 years? Why is healthcare not accessible if there is only a robot doing the surgery? Well, it's probably because we didn't open up data, and data became a commodity. And if data becomes a commodity, we make something scarce, and we don't create social value. We make it a totally valuable gold oil product that not everybody has access to. And I think when we are designing healthcare systems in Europe, we really should watch out that we don't duplicate a system that comes from a different region with very different norms and values when it comes to healthcare. Because digitalization for me is as well connected to progress and also social progress. And I find it really particular when we look at data that we forgot that when we duplicated the human in the end of last century with the Human Genome Project, which was the first time we kind of duplicated the human DNA and the human genome, that there was this huge fight because some companies, biotech companies, were trying to patent the human genome versus others, ethicists, say like, no, there should be a common good. And then this happened.
We, all of us, share a duty to ensure that the common property of the human genome is used freely for the common good of the whole human race.
And this is amazing. I never thought I would quote Tony Blair, but Tony Blair and Bill Clinton made it happen that the human genome became a common good. And then I asked myself the question, what actually happened that today we are discussing that all health data should be commoditized. So for me, healthcare is not a commodity because as you could see with the South Korean woman, data can be something as human life, just as a digital version for it. And then we should ask ourselves the question, are we going to economize on human life? Because I think there's a different future out there for data, and the Human Genome Project explicitly showed that. By opening up the human genome, they created a $1 trillion economical value output. And I don't think the price of sequencing, genome sequencing, went down from billions for one sequence of the human genome to now today $100. when it would not have been open, because openness is kind of a layer for collaboration and competition. So that's what made it probably cheaper. And I think there is no scarcity in the digital space unless we plan to make something scarce, and we really have to think what we are designing. Do we really want to make it scarce? Because I come from a tech background, and in tech we made things not scarce. Storage went cheaper, compute power went cheaper, everything went cheaper. But if you look at today, how the prices of health data are going up, we're trying to create a commodity out of data, which should not be a commodity. For me, data is something that should be a common good, as we did with the human genome, because I think companies will flourish more when we do that. And I think when we are designing our future and using these exponential technologies, there is so much promise, but do we really want that promise to only address a little part of the world and not serve others? I think we could learn a lot from software development and other tools that gave everyone globally access. And I'm going to show you an example how that works. There is a world, and if you use the digital tools completely different, you can create very much different worlds. And I'm going to give you an exercise. Imagine that you have to set up an organization that is built with an organization of over 70,000 people, and that works in 42 countries and develops personal protective equipment, something we probably all know still from during COVID. These are the gowns, the masks, and everything what we need to treat these patients. And you need to deliver 1 million goods a week of these products within 8 weeks from now. And there is this little small detail. I'm not going to give you any budget for that. And then you probably would say, like, I am totally nuts. But this is exactly what happened. When the 11th of March, we were like very early COVID. A friend of mine at Berkeley and a few others were calling, it's like, oh, let's build an open source ventilator project, because ventilators are going to get scarce. And we want to create abundance of ventilators. So the best way to do this is open sourcing it. So we called out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and all other platforms to all engineers. And within a very short time, we had a group of 80,000 people on Facebook, and we had using different platforms. And after 8 weeks, that group decentralized produced over 1 million pieces of goods in a decentralized mode using 3D printing within 8 weeks after we started, without having initial budget. And over a time span of 1 year, we produced nearly 50 million of pieces, and some innovations were really done. We started to build ventilator connectors, but then that group even went further. And we could produce 60% of the goods that were needed to treat these patients. And it was all based on open source, because open source means no walls, faster innovation, and it allowed us to even do very much different creations using exponential technologies such as 3D printing. What surprised me most is that we were able to do that cheaper. That means that the materials to use for 3D printing are still costing something, and we could produce these face shield masks for under $2, where in the pandemic times it was sold for threefold the price. And then these whole groups were forking, they were like splitting off, creating new projects such as the Apollo oxygen concentrator, because there was not enough oxygen. And that project was duplicated into another project called the Murat oxygen concentrator project in India. And then last year, when India did not have enough oxygen, a lot of people and engineers started using these open source designs and produced real medical products out of it. Out of the open source design, products were created that were very competitive, because the core was open source and the shell, well, the medical products need to be certified and everything else. So the shell was still proprietary, which is totally fine. And they were able to sell that for much cheaper money. At the end, the initial goal of creating an open source ventilator is still a dream, but we are coming close with some projects that are really doing that, something that nobody believed would happen in 2 years' time. We will see, or we have seen the development of very good equipment that can be used in low-income countries. Much other different projects started, like the COVID moonshot project, where we used folding at home compute power, decentralized, and it created molecules and synthesized molecules, and there are now over 2,000 molecules that are put on the open source license. And that giving me to the point that, like, oh, how did this happen? And I read a lot of papers, and there is not one single direction where it is. And mostly it is when we have a joint enemy. That's when we unite. We have seen this now with the threat of Russia. Europe has never been as united as today. And I said, like, do we really have to wait for the Death Star that threatens to destroy the world until we start collaborating all jointly together to overcome all the issues we see in healthcare? And we don't need COVID for that, but there are really, really good experiences here. Like the vaccine production happened super fast, and it happened fast because a lot of the data was shared openly and not looked at as a commodity, was not sold. The whole genome sequence of the first COVID virus was published as open source on virological.org, and only 3 weeks later the first phase 1 clinical trial started. So openness really accelerates and is a huge advantage. So you will have to balance when you build products. What you're going to do together with your peers, with your competitors, and start sharing? And what makes you really different? Are you going to focus on a niche market, or are you going to focus on a mass market? These are all questions you need to ask yourself. Because I come from software, and that is always been the case in the last 20 years. I can have a list here of 50 companies who have 100% open source code, and they have a value of nearly 250 billion. And that doesn't mean that they are not valuable because they're not open, but they mean they are extremely fast and innovative because they are open. And I think in healthcare we need to rethink, when you think about the application of AI and data, if everybody starts buying data, we're going to close everything up. We're not going to collaborate, and we need perhaps to rethink what we're going to do with that data. Are we going to create a social layer that is based on data exchange and collaboration, and start really competing on a different level on who builds the most beautiful and loved products, who has the best brand, the user experience, instead of who has been able to buy the most data and has created the biggest information asymmetries? It doesn't make any sense for me. And if the metaverse can generate a $1 trillion opportunity where nothing is real and everything is virtual, and Gucci can start selling dresses for $10,000 in the metaverse, I ask myself the question, can we not do the same in healthcare and stop competing on the life-saving layer of data and algorithms, and move on and move to a different world and value creation for the future? And there is proof for this. There is Open Bionics, a company from the UK that used open source 3D printed designs and has created really competitive products that are much cheaper than those who have been producing proprietary tools like Ottobock. Ottobock develops everything in a proprietary mode with their own resources. They have in total, 9,000 employees. They are a 100-year-old company. And then you have the Open Bionics, who can tap into a community of 100,000 open source developers. They're much faster, much cheaper, and they can produce in a decentralized mode. And I think Open Bionics is much more the future of healthcare as the old-fashioned way of closing everything down, because you can tap into the wisdom of the crowds and can use crowdsourcing and open source and all these digital collaboration forms and new forms of organization to build and advance. And you can do this together with patients. Like in this case, there were patients sharing their data from their continuous glucose monitoring tools on the cloud, and they developed their own algorithms that allow themselves to manage their diabetes better. On the lowest part of the screen, you see the green line. That is the open sourced algorithm from an open source group of patients that developed their own. On the top, that is what Medtronic brought to market, and which is kind of the state-of-the-art product until now, or the industry standard. So working open together with patients in a very different way is going to accelerate. So what I'm kind of proclaiming for is that you perhaps when you build products, change your mindset. And the mindset should shift away from what we call scarcity, where you always want to compete, stay on top, you fear change, you want to own everything, and you think there will never be enough to collect. First is the abundance mindset, where you think there will always be room for value creation, even if it's by creating a brand. I can always collaborate to stay on top. I don't want to close myself. I embrace change because technology is going to accelerate change. So change and being speed is much more important than being closed. And I'm open, so I take risks to collaborate. So it's all about the mindset. So when you build your products and you build your digital health applications, think what kind of world you are going to duplicate. Are you going to duplicate the world that has led to the inequalities we have seen in the world of vaccinations globally, where 50% of the world didn't have access? Or are we going to do this in a very different way and create value on a much different layer? And with that, I wish you a whole successful pitching event today. And with all the stuff, good luck on going to market. Thank you for your attention.